Assalamu alaikum everyone. I'm Saniya Gillani, your course instructor, and we are back with another lecture. This is our lecture number 13, and today we are going to talk about the age of the Puritans or the Reformation age. So, what is this age about? This age is basically going to cover roughly 1620 till 1660 in terms of its historical timeline. And for our lectures, we are going to talk about what is the Puritan age and why is this age so important. Before we begin, let's start with a little exploration of the dramatic period in English literary history, the Revolution and the Restoration from 1620 to 1690. These are the two eras that we are going to cover this week in lecture number 13 and 14. Lecture 13 covers the Revolution, the Puritan Revolution, while the next lecture is going to cover the Restoration. So, this era saw one of the most turbulent and transformative times in English history, the conflict between monarchy and the parliament, between freedom and authority, and between Puritan morality and artistic expression. In this lecture, we will focus primarily on Puritan Revolution, roughly from 1620 to 1660, which culminated in the English Civil War and the temporary fall of monarchy in England. Talking about monarchy, what was the historical background of this age? Let's set the stage a little bit. By 1620, the Renaissance confidence of Elizabeth's age had dimmed. We discussed about Renaissance previously. The Stuart monarchs, James I and Charles I, believed in divine rights of kings, while the parliament and the common people began demanding spiritual and civil liberty. For those of you who do not know about divine rights, basically, according to the divine rights of kings, the belief was that if you are a king or a queen of a country, you are basically the messenger of God and you have divine control over the citizens. The seat belongs to the ruler and his command is authoritative. No one can question it. Obviously, there is a little bit of a loophole. How can one man control an entire nation? And the parliament did not agree with this notion. Likewise, they wanted spiritual and civil social liberty. So, this conflict between the authority and the conscience of the common masses erupted in the English Civil War, which lasted roughly from 1642 to 1651. And what were the results? The execution of Charles I and the establishment of the Commonwealth, and a period dominated by Puritan rule under Cromwell. In this particular age, literature was not flourishing unlike the previous ages, but literature did not die in this austere age, it just transformed. The Puritan mind, severe yet sincere, replaced courtly grace with moral intensity. Writers asked, what is man's duty to God? What is the soul's purpose? This inward turn is what we call the revolution literature. It is a literature of faith, conscience, and struggle. The Puritan Revolution grew from a deep political and religious tension between the monarchy and the common people. After Elizabeth I's death in 1603, there wasn't a proper ruler who was able to have as control and was as good a ruler like her. James I and then Charles I ruled with strong belief in the divine king's right. I just briefly explained that. It clashed with the parliament's demand for more power. Meanwhile, Puritans were basically strict Protestants who wanted to purify the Church of England, and they opposed the king's authoritarian rule and the extravagance of the royal court. Puritans were basically a subcategory of religion in Christianity, and they were quite severe in their beliefs. This conflict led to the English Civil War. Talking about the history, And this war was between the royalists and the parliamentarians. The war ended with the execution of the ruler of the royals and the establishment of Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell, and so parliamentarians won this battle. It was a time of moral seriousness, censorship, and religious intensity. Critics like William J. Long often point out that the Puritan age was not an age of laughter or art, but of conscience and conviction. So, talking about conviction, what was the spirit of this age? What were the characteristics, and what was the belief that shaped this particular time period? This age shaped literature profoundly, but what was being celebrated here? While the Elizabethan spirit of the previous decade celebrated beauty and freedom, the Puritan spirit turned inward towards spiritual reflection, moral discipline, and individual conscience. Literature became religious, didactic, and plain. It was about teaching morality. It wasn't about entertainment. Theatres were downright closed. Poets were silenced, and writers sought expression through sermons and also religious tracts. And we also had a little bit of autobiographical prose written during this time period. To reiterate, people were basically writing a lot of sermons. Sermons are religious, you can say, speeches or debates. Then they had religious debates among themselves, religious tracts, documentations, and lastly, autobiographical prose, where they shared their experiences living in this age. This period was also quite restrictive, and this restraint gave birth to a new literary strength. That was moral depth and introspection. Introspection is looking within yourself. If the Puritan age destroyed the art of literature, it deepened its soul. This was not about entertainment and art for art's sake, it was about art with a purpose, with an intentionality behind it, and it was about the spirituality of a culture. Next point we are going to talk about is the major literary forms that were studied and also written in during the Revolution. The main forms of literature were religious prose, political pamphlets, and devotional poetry. First, start with prose and pamphlets. Prose, in the previous lectures, we discussed what are prose. Prose are everyday conversations or simple sentences that are easier for common people to understand. While pamphlets, we are all familiar with pamphlets, we receive a bunch of them every day. So they had little accounts of, you can say, religious sermons on them. This was the golden age of religious and political prose, with writers like John Milton, Thomas Browne, John Bunyan, and Jeremy Taylor. These writers used prose to express their faith, philosophy, and moral strength. We will begin with the man who is considered the best of his age, Milton. John Milton defended freedom of speech and conscience, arguing that truth should not fear open discussion. Next, this age also saw writers like Thomas Browne, who blended scientific curiosity with spiritual reflection. For Jeremy Taylor, sermons combined piety and poetic beauty. So he combined religious spirituality with aesthetic beauty of art. After prose, there comes poetry. Poetry turned inward from public themes to personal and devotional subjects. Two main groups appeared during this age. The first was the metaphysical poets. The metaphysical poets included John Donne, George Herbert, Henry Wagum, and these writers, basically Donne, Herbert, and Wagum, they were talking about complex imagery and intellectual wit to express religious devotion to their loved ones and to their gods. Examples include John Donne's Holy Sonnets and Herbert's The Temple. Next group of poets during this age were the Cavalier poets. These were loyal to the king. These writers included Robert Herrick, Richard Lovelace, and Thomas Carlyle, who wrote graceful lyrics and songs of loyalty even amid war. So these two separate groups. First group talked about religion and metaphysical qualities, connecting them with God, while the second group talked about love poetry, and they were basically just for the entertainment of the royalties. They weren't writing for some sort of revolution. During this time, most of the writers captured the fleeting nature of life and love. So, even in war and repression, English poetry showed remarkable diversity, half mystical, half worldly. I just talked about John Milton in our prose section. Now, let's discuss a little bit more about this man. He's the voice of this age. This age, the Revolution Age, is also known as the Age of Milton, thanks to John Milton. He was the last of the Elizabethans and the first of the moderns. He embodied both the grandeur of the Renaissance art and the moral seriousness of Puritanism. His life mirrors the political shifts of his age. He was educated in Cambridge, wrote early poems that talked about celebrating the beauty of society and nature, and also about learning. They were much more about aesthetics. Then, over time, he became an active writer for the Puritan cause. So he started with aesthetic poetry and slowly turned towards spiritual poetry. After the Restoration, he was blind and disillusioned, yet he wrote his greatest work, that is Paradise Lost. This book is basically uh, written in 1667, and this work transforms the Puritan vision into epic art. It deals with disobedience, freedom, and divine justice, reflecting both Milton's religious conviction and human ambition. In Milton's work, the Puritan's stern faith is united with the artist's sense of beauty. He is the culmination of the Puritan spirit, and the Puritan spirit was lofty, learned, and morally thoughtful. Lastly, what was the legacy of the Puritan? What were the legacy of the Puritan writers and the revolution they were talking about? By 1660, when the monarchy was restored under Charles II, England had changed forever. The Puritan age had given literature new themes: conscience, liberty, and dignity of the individual soul. It prepared the way for modern English prose that we are going to discuss in the upcoming lectures, and for moral idealism in later centuries. Often writers quote this age as that as the literature that does not leave a lasting impact just because of its laughter. This was the time period which became important because it brought a light, a vision for the coming ages. It was not about entertainment. The Puritan period, though stern, led the foundations of moral values in English thought that we know today. Let's discuss let's now sum up the topic. We have talked about the historical context of the time period, then we talked about the legacy of this period and the different characteristics of this age. We talked about the prose written in this age and also the poetry written in this age. And we also talked about how and why is this age still relevant today. So, to sum up, what is the Puritan age about? This age was basically about in awakening a spirit of spiritual enlightenment, moral growth, and individual introspection inside our own souls. It was about writing literature that was religious, that was moral, and that was reflecting the sentiments of the society. Puritan age had a little bit of its downfall because the literature written in this time period was quite restrictive. Despite those restrictions, there were writers who were able to express themselves freely. And the biggest example of a writer who expressed himself freely is John Milton. Paradise Lost is an epic of divine scale in which he takes the story of Adam and Eve that we are all familiar with. In almost every religion, we are familiar with a little different version of the same story. He took that, he talked about religion, he talked about individual expression, and he also talked about the importance of artistic expression in his works. So, the Puritan age, though limited in its scope, unlike the previous and the coming ages, was still a very monumental age for its period. In the next lecture, we will talk about how this age was restored in the second half of this century and what was the restoration age. Till then, Allah Hafiz, and I will see you guys soon.